it's a very nascent industry. I'm excited to see where the industry is in 5 to 7 years.
Yeah.
We all know what we've seen in, technological increases in horizontal drilling and fracking and things like that over the last 2 decades. Imagine where lithium is 20 years from now.
Yeah. I mean, just to talk about the smack over and all that. I mean, gosh, we've leased 5 or 600,000 acres worth of smack over,
Yeah.
2 different times.
Yeah.
North Louisiana, Southern Arkansas, through all that. So all that's very interesting. And it's, you think of other plays like the Austin Chalk through central Louisiana.
Mhm.
What is that? I mean, so it's not just where you have a lot of produced water, right? It has to be areas that are lithium rich, or is lithium present in all these other heavy brine producing plays? What's the concept there? How do you test that? How do they identify the areas that are viable?
Yeah. So we're really kind of at the beginning of figuring out what those viable areas are. The easiest thing to do right now is re-enter old well bores and test water. One of the things is when I say the industry first started, when the kind of land play in that northeast part of Texas, southwest part of Arkansas came about, people were thinking of it in different ways. They said, okay, we have water cuts on this old vertical production. Maybe that's how we go get this produced water. Then people were thinking, well, man, these are large commercial quantities. Let's just drill these deep brine wells. And I think it's going to be a little different depending on if you're in Texas or Arkansas or Louisiana. Right now, people in Texas are re-entering old well bores, testing water, figuring out whether it's viable. Louisiana hasn't seen quite the benefit of the rush to get water out of the Smackover that Texas and Arkansas have. And we've got to keep in mind the Smackover goes all the way across to Florida, right?
Yeah.
Like it is
Yeah.
it is not just a Southwest Arkansas, Northeast Texas thing. It is all
No.
across the southeastern United States.
I mean, we've leased
And
smack over in Mississippi, Texas, Arkansas,
yeah,
and Louisiana
yeah,
over the years.
yeah. And one of the things that's going to make determining viability easier is that, and I worked on this at the legislature this year through some lobbying efforts for clients. We realized late last year, early this year, that the Railroad Commission of Texas, which has jurisdiction over all things oil and gas, right? They had a permitting process for brine wells, but those were brine injection wells.
Yeah.
We had no one had ever looked at this until the last few years and said, man, I really want to take a lot of salt water out of the earth without getting the oil and gas along with it. Right. Everybody just wanted to put it back into the earth.
Yeah. It was
And
just something they had to deal with.
yeah, yeah, there's another white paper recently written on brine, and I think it's called "One Man's Trash is Another Man's Treasure," and that's really appropriate for brine at the moment. So we went to the Railroad Commission and we said, "Hey, just want to make sure you guys are looking at this the same way we are. Your regulations really only account for permitting wells where we are injecting brine, primarily for secondary recovery operations." And they said, yep, that's our brine and well statute. So we went and rewrote the legislation or rewrote the statutes and passed some legislation this last session that gives the Railroad Commission jurisdiction over actual brine production wells. That's the nomenclature that we gave it, were brine production wells. So that was kind of the first step in figuring out, okay, for viability, we've got to drill these test wells. We need to figure out what the permitting process is for that. Let's clarify it at the Railroad Commission. So we did it. Right now, in Texas, we have yet to see a rush of people drilling their own brine production wells. And I regularly check permits to see what's going on. We've had some re-entries of well bores for the purpose of testing brine, but no big major commercial drilling plans at the moment because we are still really early in the land grab phase. And
Yeah.
for most of your listeners who are landmen, that's the most interesting part for me is the land grab phase, because the first question is, well, what exactly are you grabbing? Are we
Yeah.
grabbing the surface owner? Are we grabbing the mineral owner? Or are we doing some combination of the two? And I think that question will be better answered during the next legislative session, which is 2025, unfortunately. But until then, it's kind of going to be a wild west. And so here's the lay of the land in Texas, so to speak, on ownership of brine and ownership of constituent elements and minerals. And I'll start by giving an analog to Arkansas. Arkansas has had a brine industry for a long time. And in the 1970s, people realized that you could produce brine to extract commercial quantities of bromine. And bromine's used in a lot of different stuff. And so companies like Albemarle have been quietly operating in Southwest Arkansas outside of Magnolia and El Dorado and places like that for decades. And in the 70s, people realized the same issue we're seeing now in Texas. Oh my gosh, when people reserved oil, gas, and other minerals, were they intending to reserve constituent elements and minerals in the saltwater? Was that something that was foreseeable at the time? So, subject to this weird doctrine called the Strohauer doctrine, I believe, or something to that effect, in Arkansas, they settled ownership of constituent elements and minerals, particularly brine and lithium, through legislation. And they settled on it. And you don't have those questions in Southwest Arkansas. But you jump down to Texas, and we haven't made it that far yet. And in Texas, we have a much stronger mineral lobby than they do in Arkansas. And case law in Texas has been settled for a long time that brine itself is owned by the surface owner. There's this old case called Robbins versus Robinson Petroleum. And in that case, an operator was producing brine as part of a big unit from one surface owner's tract and using it as kind of a secondary recovery operation to water flood the rest of the unit to drive up reservoir pressure. And the surface owner came and said, "Hey, man, you're using part of my estate for the benefit of other mineral estates. I get it if you're using my surface to benefit my mineral estate, but you're taking my surface and going to produce other mineral estates with it. I don't think you can do that." And in that case, the Supreme Court of Texas came and said, "Yep, brine's a part of the surface estate." So we've operated for years that brine is part of the surface estate. What it didn't say was the constituent elements and minerals in brine, what estate are they part of? We know things like salt are part of the mineral estate. And obviously there are high dilutions of salt in hypersaline water like brine. So will the court ultimately say that lithium, when people did things like reserved oil, gas, and other minerals, is part of that other minerals reservation? I mean, in its very basic function, lithium is a mineral. I mean, it's one of the things listed on the periodic table. I recently wrote a paper on the topic called Element 3. And the reason I named it Element 3 is because lithium falls as the third element on the periodic chart. Go back to your high school chemistry class, whether you loved it or not.
I just had a flashback to Mr. Sinsat's class.
Yeah. Shout out to Mrs. Wilson for me. So the question is a good one, but until the legislature says, or the legislature will say it first, right? Court cases take forever. We'll never get a court case in the next 2 years that says who owns lithium.
Yeah.
The legislature will have to address it in 2025. So what do you do until then? Like, how do you approach it? We, and when I say we, I mean kind of the oil and gas lawyer bar, we all think ultimately that lithium is a part of the reservation of other minerals. We have this situation that popped up in the 80s where things like uranium and lignite and all those other minerals that we forgot about when we were making oil, gas, and other mineral reservations were litigated. Like, were those part of the reservation of other minerals? So at the time, the court kind of did this bifurcation of how you determine it. And you look at the date in the 1980s, and if your reservation is before a certain date, you may look at this thing called the surface destruction test. Is it going to destroy the surface of your estate to go get this mineral? And if it does, maybe the mineral is part of the surface estate. If you're after that date in 1980, you look at this thing called the ordinary and natural meaning test. And so is lithium a part of the ordinary and natural meaning of the word mineral? And I think the question for the second part, those reservations after 1980, is yes, absolutely yes. I think that people, if you say, what is lithium? The response would be, oh yeah, it's a mineral, or it's a mineral-like substance. Now the question about those reservations before then, the whole surface destruction test issue, is an interesting one, because technically, because brine is part of the surface, are you destroying the surface estate in order to acquire lithium? And that's a fascinating one for me.
It's it plays both sides of the fence.